Okay, David, thank you very much for the introduction and description of NCUB. It's fascinating, I think, and plays a very important role in, as you rightly say, just trying to catalyse what is already a vibrant environment, but trying to get the best out of it. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen today. I won't spend too long talking to you because I'd like to give you the opportunity to engage and ask questions as you see fit. So we'll try and get to that as soon as possible. I do think I'd just take maybe 15 or 20 minutes just to tee things up a little bit. Before I do that, I'd like to do the most important thing I'm going to do today, which is say thank you to the people who really helped to execute and get done this review and project, particularly Robin Webb and the entire team who Biz put together for us and did a tremendous job. Ramil from my office at GSK, who was also very heavily involved, and also the advisory group that we put together, of whom I know Julia and Graham are here. I'm not sure if any others are here, but were also extremely helpful in making sure that we tried to keep on the straight and narrow and reined in some of my more exuberant but incorrect views of the world. I'm not going to go through, and you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to show you any slides. It's not my habit, so I didn't think I'd break it today. I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations because one thing I'm pretty confident of is if you're in this room, you can probably read. So I'm working on the basis that you've probably read it. If you haven't read it all, you've probably read at least the first 4 or 5 pages. So I wasn't going to go through all of that. I did think, though, that I might just try and bring to life a little bit some of the kind of overriding themes, which I do refer to in the foreword, and a little bit of what kind of got me interested in this in the first place. And that might be a gentler way of explaining why some of the recommendations there, rather than simply repeating what you've already read. So what kind of got me interested in the first place was certainly a sense from my day job, where I spend most of my time outside of the UK, that there is my impression, which was validated through the review, that the UK is above average, probably far above average, in terms of world capability of inventiveness, but possibly, and I think actually I conclude that was the right view through the review, that we're probably average or possibly even a bit less than average in terms of our ability to extract that inventiveness and turn them into British jobs. I deliberately and repeatedly referred in various conversations to creation of jobs, because it's not good enough simply to have the technology leave a university lab, at least not for Britain. It might be good enough for the individuals involved, but for the country, what's important is it leaves the lab, turns into an asset, which then is retained or is sticky to the UK and allows the creation of jobs and enterprise and everything else. And I think that is an area where we are not above average. I'll be generous and say we're average. I suspect we may not be even there. And so that was one element of what got me interested in this, and I believe that we could do better. The second, which really flips to the completely other side of this whole matrix of what everybody's trying to make work, is really the policy agenda of how economic growth is thought about in government. And hopefully Martin Donnelly, who's the Perm Sec at Biz, isn't going to shoot me for saying something which is confidential to government. But there was a Biz board meeting about a year ago, maybe slightly less than a year ago, where an analysis was shared. It was one of those appendices, number 477, nobody's supposed to look at. There was an appendix which was a chart which the Cabinet Office had plotted the last, I think, 40 years of regional growth policy implementations in Britain. And what it showed was that typically, I think over the 40 years, there had been about 40 different policy interventions, and some of which you will immediately remember, some of which, thank God, are long forgotten. But they're very frequent policy interventions. Ironically, they cluster around general elections. Leave that for your own consideration, what that means. Equally interesting that economic cycles don't typically cluster around elections, but nonetheless, these policies did. What was fascinating was that I think, without exception, the policies which were described through history were all dominated by geographic, bureaucratic configurations. And that sounds a bit pejorative, but you get the point, right? It was just reorganizing how we organize geographies. And we gave them different names, we changed the borders, we went from, you name it, we've tried every single thing over 40 years. What was really striking through that 40-year period is, first of all, economic growth wasn't transformed, and we all know that. Secondly, economic growth was actually super concentrated into very few sectors, particularly the finance sector, so it didn't do anything beneficial for the diversification of the economy. And thirdly, the economy is super concentrated in the southeast. So despite having 40 years of extraordinarily active policy intervention across both sides of the political spectrum, actually, at best, you can say it had no impact on the trends. At worst, you could say it made it worse. And so that plus the view that we weren't doing the job as well as we could for translation is really what convinced me this was worth looking at. And it's why in the forward I make the point right at the very beginning that we should be thoughtful about economic policy, driven first through the lens of technology and opportunity and secondarily through the lens of geography. Now, I know that's quite challenging for a lot of people who see their environment, their power, frankly, influenced by the geographic matrix. And I'm not for a minute saying that geography is not important, because ultimately everything is always local in the end. It's simply a question of where you start. Do you start by saying to a town, you have the choice to be whatever you want to be? Or do you start by saying, it so happens in your area there is a remarkable technology, let's really focus our energies to exploit that and find a way for it to be fixed and located and sticky to your town. You end up, in theory, in the same place, but the evidence of the last 40 years says that by going geography first doesn't appear to be a transformationally positive process. So the first part of this is to say, let's look first at the technology lens, think about aligning our energies around that, reducing the complexity around that, and then finding ways to drive the intersect between the technology opportunity and the geography in the most constructive way possible, which is why I make various comments about LEPs as well as universities. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that universities have changed out of all and many of you in this room know this much better than I do. Universities have changed out of all recognition in the last 30 years. When I graduated from the University of Nottingham, there were 7,000 people at the University of Nottingham. There are now over 30,000 students at that university, and it by no means is the largest in the UK, and it's by no means an outlier in terms of its evolution. It has a business school, it has startup incubator parks, it has multi-faculties. It is an enormous economic powerhouse in Nottingham. And you could go to Manchester, to Birmingham, to Bristol, to the South Coast, to Newcastle, to Scotland, and the same is true. The universities are very often the largest single economic institution in the regions, and they have the most extraordinary diversity and breadth of strengths, of skills. Now, they have been rightly devoted to two very primary agendas, basic research and education. They have, over time, naturally grown into and wanted to evolve into something further than that, which is much more the applied economic impact that those institutions are latently capable of producing. And we all know there are some fantastic examples of doing that. But in some places, and in some sense, it's kind of done a little bit in spite of the incentive system that exists, rather than because of the incentive system that exists. And I was struck at and again, it's in the forward, the very first physical evidence gathering session we had up in Newcastle, I was absolutely struck by the quote that Britain doesn't breed entrepreneurs, it breeds endurance entrepreneurs, because you have to be so dedicated and so dog-headed to get things spun out. You can do it, but we have a self-selection process which makes it very difficult for people to do it. And again, that just brought to life to me this notion, not that we have to invent anything new, we just have to align our incentives, and we need to a little bit get out of our own way, a little bit streamline the complexity, a little bit focus on the right metrics, which again, I hope comes through in a lot of these recommendations. Which really brings me to the last part, which is there is deliberately nothing in this report, and I really do think there is nothing in this report which is not happening somewhere in Britain. So there is no dream in this report that we have to invent a behaviour that has never been experienced in Britain. Everything that is in this report is being done by some people somewhere in Britain. The question is, Why can't we try and get it done on the average and maybe everywhere so that we could really take very much more substantial advantage of the opportunity that exists, particularly within the universities? So what does that then mean in a nutshell about what we need to try and change and why some of the recommendations? Well, first of all, if we want universities, on the average, to be more forward-leaning in terms of applied economic activity, we need to tell them, we need to incent them, and we need to measure it. We also need to acknowledge that universities aren't owned and run by government, so they are independent bodies, and they need to therefore have a degree of subtlety around how those signals are sent. The message I got back from, without exception, every university we engaged with who volunteered information is they're absolutely up and ready for that kind of challenge. They're looking for that kind of encouragement. Of course, they're looking for funding, but they're looking for the whole complement of what is it we really want from them, how are we going to measure, and that's what underpins a number of those points. Secondly, we need to recognise that it's all sorts of universities. And I think the debate we've had over many years about, is it just about elite research universities, or is it about the new universities, is it about what used to be politics, is a completely sterile discussion. We should think about Britain as a football team. And a great football manager or a great football team doesn't spend all day arguing whether or not a centre forward is a more important player than the goalkeeper. It's self-evident that they're all critical. And within a system like the UK, it's obvious that you need a diversity of academic institutions which each individually and therefore collectively provide the kind of team impact that the country needs to be able to execute successfully in the economic competition. We need to make sure that the LEPs, as the chosen vehicle of regional growth focus, are helped. One of the things that came out super strongly through the reviews was a sense of LEPs, sometimes brilliant. You know, half a dozen LEPs, maybe 10 LEPs in the country, off and running, nothing to worry about. Maybe 2/3 of the LEPs feeling a little bit bereft of guidance, a little bit lost, not sure what to do, and not enough resources. We can't be sat here, and I can tell you I met with some very senior politicians in London who think the LEPs have everything they absolutely need to solve the economic challenges of the country. I don't think anybody who runs a LEP believes that. And so we need to join those dots. We need to get people to understand how we help LEPs be that absolutely critical interface between university technology and geography to make sure we get things right. So the LEPs have some work to do, and government has some work to do in terms of helping them understand their role better, sharing best practice. David mentioned the importance of NCUB in terms of data provision. The reason I put the maps in the report is not because I think these maps are fantastic, although I think Robin and the team, frankly, did an extraordinary amount of work to get what we've got. I put them in the report to reveal the exact point that we don't have a high-quality shared data set to understand where our technology opportunities are. So the first thing lots of people will do is look at the map and say, my university's not on this map. Well, exactly. How can you expect people from all over the world to come and invest appropriately and efficiently in Britain if even we don't know where our technologies are buried? And if we haven't got a way of making that easily available, which is why data provision is so important. The very last thing I would say, as a theme that runs through the report, is partly, I think, because of the history of policy being driven by geography, and partly because of some of the natural behaviours of academics in universities, and that's probably going to alienate a few friends in the audience, but because of that, we have too much intra-British competition in this system. We are too motivated to be the best in Britain, rather than for Britain to be the best in the world. And the reality is, it doesn't really matter whether Sheffield is better at something than Newcastle, if it turns out both of them are ranked number 52 in the world. If we want to compete and rebuild a more balanced economy, we have to be competitive on a global stage. And so the final part is to say, look, actually, let's embrace the idea that actually Britain, and obviously England for a lot of this discussion because of the devolution status, Britain is a relatively small place with an extraordinarily high density of universities and opportunity. Can't we do a better job of driving collaboration and being a little bit more open-minded around the size of the clusters that we can generate in the UK. Again, some of that is already happening. As I've said at the beginning, nothing in this report doesn't exist somewhere in the UK. The theme of the report is to try and bring a bit of edge to the way in which we all try and encourage the kind of practices which we know are exhibited in the best and which hopefully could be represented by the majority. With that, David, I think I'll stop my comments and obviously take questions later. Thank you.